seat over there.
What a pleasure to be with you.
What a
all.
pleasure to have you in our midst. For the at-home audience, I just want to introduce ourselves once again. My name is David Rubin, and this is the legendary Lynn Stalmaster. I'm going to try my best to channel James Lipton and start with the beginning. Where were you born?
Omaha, Nebraska.
And is it indiscreet to ask you the date?
No, November 17th, 1927.
Lynn just celebrated his 86th birthday. What did your parents do?
My parents?
Yeah.
My father, who was a remarkable man, and by the way, very supportive of me as an actor. That doesn't always happen. And he was on the Supreme Court of Nebraska at the age of 30, 32, I don't know. And he was just a very perceptive. He instilled a lot of ideas in me that carried on not only to this day, but into casting. And in terms of minorities and not being too judgmental. Anyway.
At some point you came to Los Angeles.
Yes, I had very severe asthma. And you know, the climate in Nebraska, it goes from one extreme to the other. And he had some sinus issues. So he picked up and brought the family to California in 1938. And
You were about 11 or 12.
yeah,
And you went to Beverly Vista School?
I went to Beverly Vista School. We lived on Olympic Boulevard in Beverly Hills, below the tracks. And I was very shy, very hesitant, particularly with women. And but I noticed that I gave the valedictorian speech at Beverly Vista.
In 6th grade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was my first coming out publicly. And then I went to Beverly Hills High School. And
Is that where you discovered acting?
yes, they had a marvelous radio acting. Radio was still a major outlet for actors. And we were on KMPC. And then between my junior and senior year, I applied for a session, summer session at Stanford University and took a course there. And I actually lucked out and had a professional appearance on a radio show in San Francisco. But at that point, radio was my goal.
And following the stint up at Stanford and your focus on radio, you contemplated a move to New York, right?
Yes, my dad was going there on business, and I applied to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, which then was a predominant acting school in New York. I auditioned, and I was actually accepted. And then I made the choice, for many reasons, I won't go into all of them, to go to attend UCLA, where they had a great theater department. So I was able to continue appearing in plays, and mainly the great thing about it was a variety of characters. Anywhere from an old man in Shakespeare.
You were John of Gaunt in Richard,
I was John of
Richard
Gaunt.
II. Yes.
And with terrible makeup, you can imagine.
Did you have those red dots on the inside of your eyes and the white line down your nose?
But they gave me the opportunity there to play such a variety of roles. And you know, I was dependent upon my instincts. I hadn't been trained, as most of you have, and I found that I could escape into characters in the theater, even though I was still quite shy. But the minute I got on stage and the audience was there, I was able to lose myself in the character.
So toward the end of your time at UCLA, who was Sam Manners?
So there were a lot of people who went into the motion picture industry in my class. Steve Forrest, Jeff Hunter, Nancy Olson, who, as you know, was in Sunset Boulevard. We had an incredible group of talented actors. Some went on to teach, but many had
careers.
Kathleen Freeman was in that class. And
Sam Manners.
Sam Manners was in the class, and when we graduated, he went on and obtained a position as an assistant to Lou Wasserman at MCA when they had that grand building on Little Santa Monica Boulevard. None of you probably knew about that. And I don't know if you would call me a hip pocket, but I was represented briefly. And, you know, and then
Let me just point out to the folks who don't know about Lou Wasserman at MCA, it was the preeminent, in a way, the CAA, the WME of its time. At that time, when they represented Lynn, hip pocket or no, they represented Betty Davis, James Stewart, Judy Garland, Henry Fonda, Myrna Loy, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Gregory Peck, Gene Kelly, Billy Wilder, Alfred Hitchcock, Montgomery Clift, Marlon Brando, and Lynn Stalmaster.
No, I couldn't believe it. You know, what am I doing here? And, but in any event, they were beginning to get me interviews for motion pictures. And one day they sent me out to meet Nicholas Ray. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. Did he do Rebel Without a Cause?
He directed Rebel Without a Cause.
A very sensitive actor's director. And who was the star of the picture but John Wayne and Robert Ryan.
And the movie was called?
Flying Leathernecks. It shows every 20 minutes on television. And a lot of the old pictures that I was involved in are still showing. And then I did a picture with a cult.
Well, before that, before on Flying Leathernecks, you played a soldier, right? Who was sent into battle?
It was a picture called The Steel Helmet.
Oh, right.
And was directed by Samuel Fuller, who was a cult, some of you know Samuel Fuller, a cult director. And I had the last scene. And so...
This was a time, excuse me, that was sort of the waning years of the old studio system.
Right.
What was it like being an actor in that world?
I want to tell you, it was very uncomfortable. In the old studio system, number one, you know they had a list of contract players, including older character actors. And it was not a friendly, for a new actor, it was not a friendly environment, and rather mechanical and stilted, and I didn't sense that most of the casting people at that time were that, had lived through and knew what we go through. But it was, I will point out, it was a great experience for me when I ended up on the other side of the desk.
And how did Audie Murphy, the great Western star, factor into your career trajectory?
Well, many producers said, yeah, he's a good actor, but he looks he's a replica of Audie Murphy, who turned out to be, you know, a major star. I don't know if he ever trained as an actor. He was a war hero, major war hero.
It would be like looking too much like Tom Cruise, and, you know, they said, well, why aren't we getting Tom Cruise?
You went through that with an actor.
Yeah.
And so, in any event, that was one of the reasons that I became a bit discouraged. And there were other reasons. And I decided, do you need to ask me anything more about that period?
No, I just was curious. I was curious about how you made the transition.
You got to edit, Lynn.
And started to hardly, and more.
And I was very lucky. I played the lead in some television series at Universal, what have you. And I wasn't always that comfortable, as I was in the theater, with the film medium, you know, and the restrictions, which, by the way, I admire in actors, under those hot lights, so often with very poor ventilation, and
a crew standing around.
And having to meet marks in addition. But I tip my hat to actors who deal with all that and still perform.
So you sought out a production job? Is that what you did?
I did. I decided, for other reasons, you know, would I ever get married and have children, and just a general insecurity. And I figured I could always come back to acting. And as I grew older, I was, you know, a young man then, and I started to seek a position in production. And fortunately, my family had a contact with the producer, and there were two of them, Jack Gross and Phil Krasny, and they had a number of television shows on the network. So they accepted me as a PA, as a producer's assistant. And I really generally was a gopher. I'd go for the tuna sandwiches. I'd carry the film to the screening room, the dailies. And I sat in on all these writers' conferences. And I figured someday I'd have a fallback position if the acting didn't work out.
Did they ever cast you in any of their shows?
I did appear. I was even a continuing character with a tiny part.
Rush the Copy Boy, perhaps?
On Big Town.
I would love to see your performance as Rush the Copy Boy.
Oh, and that was also to supplement my income because I was paid nothing, you know. But one day, shall we get to that?
Yes.
They called me into the office and they said, Lynn, our casting director, Ralph Acton was his name, he was from that old school, that the studio kind of thinking, which was contract players and using the character people who were marvelous in every picture, you know what I mean?
Playing the same kind of role over and over
again. Yeah, we're playing
again.
the same kind of role. And they said, he's retiring. We'd like you to cast our television shows. Hello? You know, usually, David, most casting directors are assistants or then become associates and have years of preparation. And I want, you know, and there's so many outstanding casting directors who didn't come from the acting field necessarily. And I could do a long number on that. And so they gave me an office on the lot. This was California Studios. This was a rickety, the offices were rickety old buildings that were probably there during the silent film era. And I don't know is it Raleigh today?
Raleigh, yeah.
Yeah. And I had to educate myself from scratch. I knew a few actors, but so I would spend my days from early in the morning till early evening meeting actors and eventually beginning for specific roles reading actors. And I found it so gratifying to be able to reach out a helping hand as people had reached out to me over the years, including those two producers, and pull actors aboard. So agents also learned that I wanted to meet as much new talent as they believed in, and certain agents had an eye that was superior. And also I said, And if anybody comes in from New York or Chicago or London, please, I want to meet them. So I was building this inventory, and you know very well the market of actors changes every day. It grows, and new actors come on the scene.
What was it, how different was it then in terms of the way agents represented their clients? Because today, of course, everything is done online, on the internet, and submissions are done, and demo reel links are sent. But I understand that back then, agents literally would go door to door with a briefcase of their actors.
Exactly.
8x10s, is that right?
Yeah, and of course I invited them all in and spent time with them, and I said, you know, let me meet as many as I can, and I'll eventually meet everybody. And this, you know, was so rewarding.
And then you heard about a show coming to the lot.
There was a Western coming on the lot, and it suddenly hit me. I'd love to do shows outside of Gross Krasny. And I went in, and I went to Gross Krasny and I said, would you mind, hat in hand, would you mind if I opened my own independent casting office? Not knowing how they'd react. And they said yes. So I went to the meeting on that, and I explained to them that I love to use new faces, and that there were so many minorities, Europeans, African Americans, Hispanics.
Women.
Women, that became a big issue for me. And that in the West, as I knew it, you know, there was a mixture of all sorts of people that came from foreign places. And when I walked down the stairs after, I said, I think you blew it. They probably wanted to hear, you know, we'd rather stick with the people that are currently appearing. The phone rang the next morning, and they said, we'd love to have you cast Gunsmoke. I tell you, it was, can you imagine this young guy, this young punk? And I found, and this is an important point, that the directors, many of them, like Andy McLaughlin and others, you know, were only familiar with the Western players. But, and this is a key word in my career, they were open to meeting new people. And so I was bringing in for readings. And by the way, ultimately, so many of the New York directors as well as actors were migrating, this is in the early 50s, were migrating to LA.
Such as?
Oh, let's see. Well, first of all, Martin Landau, Murray Hamilton.
Oh, these are the actors that had come out
these
here.
are the actors.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of all the others, you know, but it was a brand new influx. And by the way, when I first started casting, all of these actors, particularly from New York, needed film, you know, to be able to say, I've appeared in film. So then the directors that started to direct Gunsmoke, and then I didn't have Gun Will Travel, which followed. I only did that briefly because of what I'll tell you in a moment. And, but I mean, some of the people that directed were Mark Rydell, Arthur Hiller, I'll think of others, and then you know, I was able to introduce a lot of these New York actors into Westerns. So they had an open mind.
Yeah. Then you got a call, I think, about a Frank Sinatra project?
Frank Sinatra in 1956 wanted to do a Western. And I happen to know a director. I cast a show of his called Hennessy. And so Frank Sinatra played the lead. It was a very ordinary little Western. And he wanted all of his favorite Western actors. So it wasn't a creative joy, but to go on the set and be with Frank Sinatra. And
Starting in the big leagues. I looked all over the place for a review of Johnny Concho. Good luck trying to find a copy of it. I found one review from the Village Voice, actually, in New York at the time.
Really?
Yes. There is almost nothing to say about this first attempt by Frank Sinatra to produce independently, except to wonder how anyone with his experience and talent could have become entangled in so inept a movie. There was nowhere to go but up, Lynn.
But I got to meet my idol.
Tell me about Jim Lister, because as you started to get busier and busier in television.
Yes. What happened is, as I began to be fortunate enough to be invited to cast so many series, and I could never say no, I thought that I needed an associate. And Jim Lister had just come out from New York. He was an agent, actually. And he had a real, I could tell, an excellent eye. And so I said, Jim, come aboard. And I won't go into all the shows that he cast, but we had a mutual philosophy about the quality of casting, you know. So
You were doing a lot of series at the time. The Untouchables, Combat, Twilight Zone.
yeah, he was handling a lot of those.
But how do you I mean, if you were working with those kind of directors and doing all those shows, this was before cell phones. And you were running all over town.
Yeah, that was a major problem because, in other words, while I'm driving from Culver City to Disney, I wanted to talk to my office and you know, impart some instructions.
There were barely payphones in Los Angeles, even at that time.
No, and so that was an obstacle, obviously.
And then in 1956 or 57...
Around 56, I was sitting in my little office, and the phone rings, and the lady on the other end says, Mr. Stalmaster, Robert Wise would like to meet you. Robert Wise? How did he know about me? You know, and so I went over, then it was
Robert Wise, who edited Citizen Kane.
Yeah, and had directed some Paul Newman, but you know, he was a consummate director. So I went over to Goldwyn Studios, and I explained to him my philosophy of casting, and that I'd love to bring, I felt that to bring a truth to characters by not casting the expected, and introducing a lot of new faces to film. And he said, well, I'm doing a film called I Want to Live. Susan Hayward was already set. And
Playing Barbara Graham.
Barbara Graham, the first woman executed in the state of California. And he said, I like that idea. He said, and also I want to cast a number of actors who actually resemble, because it had been in the newspapers, the actual characters in the life of Barbara Graham. And he drafted me into the big leagues. And it was just so unexpected. And
it's an extraordinary film. I recommend it to anybody who hasn't seen it, and it's full of actors that you've never seen in any other films. I don't even know if some of those people have even gone on to careers, but their faces were indelible and literally feel like they're ripped from the headlines. Really, really beautiful, beautiful work.
now what that enabled me to do, and as actors require champions, casting directors, that enabled me to move on into more films on the Goldman lot. And what were some of the directors?
Well, we'll get to each of them in a moment.
Yeah.
But before we leave Robert Wise, you also worked for him on West Side Story.
West Side Story, and also collaborated with Jerome Robbins.
What was that like? That was your first musical experience?
Yes. Later, as you know, I did Fiddler on the Roof, and it was a particular challenge because we not only had to find people that could act, but who could move, who were either skilled dancers, singers, and again, the opportunity to be part of that film.
Did you go to New York and see a lot of theater
I did,
performers?
and that's when I first started. I made so many trips to New York over the years, away from home a lot of the time, and unfortunately there wasn't a young actress of a Hispanic background around at that time who could fully
Play
perform.
Maria.
And Bob Relier, one of the producers, told me this story, which I didn't even realize. He said, one day you brought up Natalie Wood. Well, we couldn't find the answer as we wished, and but you know what I remember, David? On I Want to Live, I knew of an actor in New York named Simon Oakland, and who passed away very young. And so I invited him in to do, for the reporter who covered the Barbara Graham case. And what I did is I told his agent to have him call me, and I gave him some background on the character, which I would always try to do with actors, because they don't get to read the whole script. As a rule, you don't get to read it. And he came in, he had a hearing aid in his ear, which this character had, and he really was in character. Now, as a result of Simon playing the reporter, the lead in that, when we were doing West Side Story, he ended up playing Officer...
Krupke.
No, not Krupke. Was it...
The other officer.
The other officer. So, anyway, I'm wandering off here.
No. I mean, I was wanted to get to the Natalie Wood casting because it was controversial, ultimately very successful for the film. And it's just an example of, how it's a fluid process that often, occasionally, at least, involves compromise. But sometimes when you're stuck, inspiration like that, which I'm sure was yours, made it work. Working with Robert Wise led to you're working with a lot of great directors, in some ways connected to Robert Wise and then beyond.
Well, Robert Wise was directly or indirectly responsible for my motion picture career.
Because what followed was Billy Wilder.
Well wait, before you do that,
go.
The mirror. He talks too much. My daughter will tell you that. But the Mirish Corporation was the quality production company.
Yeah.
And United Artists was involved in all of these pictures. So it enabled me then to, and they must have talked to Robert Wise or one of the Mirishes or something about, who is this guy? Who is this lady? I got a lot of it. And fortunately, Bob and I had a rapport beyond belief. we would sit in a room, his office, for hours, not talking, but I would draw out from him what he was thinking so I could deliver. And then but they were always open, these directors. It didn't have to be that way. So that led me to, I'll mention a few and then you can mention. Billy Wilder, did several pictures with him. William Wyler. I get emotional when I start talking about this. Well, go ahead.
I'll go through it, and then we'll touch on each of them briefly, individually. Billy Wilder, William Wyler, Stanley Kramer, John Sturgis, George Roy Hill, Norman Jewison, Robert Mulligan, who introduced you to Gregory Peck, I think, which was an important relationship.
Yeah, we became a very good friends.
Sidney Pollack, Hal Ashby, John Cassavetes, the list goes on. This sort
Even
of brings,
George Roy Hill did a picture out there. And
yeah, this brings us into an extraordinary period in your casting career in the 60s and the 70s, where I don't think you could go to the theater and not see Lynn Stalmaster's name associated with a great, great film. I think it started in 1960 with Stanley Kramer and Inherit the Wind.
yes.
And then followed shortly thereafter with Judgment at Nuremberg.
Can you imagine that experience? And that was the first picture, and at this point I was all of these directors, by the way, who you would have thought would be wary of casting actors that they didn't know. And I brought an actor to Stanley Kramer by the name of William Shatner. And he played the assistant to Spencer Tracy during the trial. And you can see that all of these celebrated directors had open minds about, oh yeah, bring me people I don't know.
You also used famous people in interesting ways. In Judgment at Nuremberg, casting Judy Garland and Marlene
you've got to
Dietrich
remember,
in ways that they had never been used before, in heavy, dramatic, really dramatic roles.
But remember, all of these people Stanley Kramer knew. And so I don't want to take
Well, you can
credit,
take credit,
but we
and
would
then I'm
exchange
sure the
it.
dialogue was
Yeah.
had about the best way to populate those roles, and those were bold choices. They really were. And another very different film with Stanley Kramer, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World.
Now,
One of the great comedies.
You know, a word that I detest, and there are several, is the word I discovered. No, we're instrumental in your careers. And you discovered you had the talent and pursued it. But I filled in all the subsidiary roles, you know, that weren't the famous names.
Everybody in comedy was in that film.
Oh,
Unbelievable. Milton Berle, Buddy Hackett, Mickey Rooney, Jonathan Winters, Zazu Pitts, Leo Gorcey, Joey Brown,
Spencer Tracy,
Jimmy
was the lead,
Durante.
and they all wanted to work with Spencer Tracy, of course.
Crazy.
But Stanley was open on, you know, with him I did one with, a film with John Cassavetes. I did a film called A Child is Waiting, which happened to be on TCM the other day. And
1963.
yeah, and he was one of my favorite actors, is one of my favorite actors of all time. Steve Hill, who is a consummate actor, and people like Sidney Pollack and Mark Rydell, you know, really respected him so much. And
That was Judy Garland and Burt Lancaster,
yes,
right? And Elizabeth Wilson, who was a favorite of yours.
yes,
Because she went on to play the mother in The Graduate,
right.
right? Then William Wyler, the director of Jezebel, Wuthering Heights, Roman Holiday, Ben-Hur, calls you.
And the Children's
Hour.
And let's see.
That was an adaptation of a Lillian Hellman play.
Right, and that was starred Shirley MacLaine
And Audrey Hepburn.
and Audrey Hepburn. And James Garner in one of his earliest parts. But even William Wyler, and by the way, he was hard of hearing, which I can now appreciate. So I had to shout. But he too said, when I brought him children or brought him actors for other roles, he didn't have anybody in mind. He wasn't going to say, I want to use that actor I just cast him, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I don't want to labor that.
No. And then Billy Wilder, a number of films with him. The first was Irma la Douce, right?
Irma la Douce.
Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine.
And again, I'm very proud to say I was instrumental in the early career of James Caan, a spectacular actor. And for example, he did small roles in Ben Casey and so many other things because I wanted actors to get to know directors. I wanted them to take the steps into later, I was casting films. In fact, I was casting a little film with Olivia de Havilland called, I've choked.
Lady in the Cage? No.
Lady in a Cage.
Good. Thank you.
Whoa. Come up here. I need you. And the director of that was a man named Walter Grauman, and I brought in James Caan for the lead. And he played it. Imagine for him being able to, it was just a 2-character show. And it was another step for, James Caan. But I hate that word discover, believe me. It's not, if it wasn't me, it would be David or one of the other very, very gifted casting directors who were here and who've existed since the 50s. Mm-hmm.
And then after Irma la Douce, you did Kiss Me Stupid with Billy Wilder and The Fortune Cookie, Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. And he, I would imagine, was an entertaining chap to spend time with.
I would sit in with him. His writing partner was I.A.L. Diamond, who was a very quiet, he sits like this on a chair, and you say, how can he write comedy? And he and Billy would be talking, in between our discussing the characters, and he was such a delight. And I was so honored to have experienced a relationship with him. I mean, yeah.
Then Norma Jewison is someone with whom you had a long collaboration.
Yes, and Norman came on the lot. All of these brilliant directors kept coming onto the Goldwyn lot, mainly for the Mirisch Corporation. And I think the first picture I did with Norman was
a comedy, right?
Huh?
Wasn't it The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming?
In the Heat of the Night.
No.
And in that film, Sidney Poitier, of course, and Rod Steiger won the Academy Award. But we cast an ensemble that I'm very proud of, being a part of. And in fact, an actor I have a lot of admiration for. I was about to set an actor. Do any of you know the film In the Heat of the Night? You remember there was a young man arrested and put in jail, and Poitier went to see him. I was about to cast that role and was literally on the verge of setting somebody Norman had approved. And an agent called me and said, I just saw a young actor in a play. I don't know if it was in the Valley or Orange County. Have you set that part yet? And I said, no, I'm about to. He said, well, wait a minute. Jack Fields was the agent. And this young actor came over and read for me, either then or I gave him sides and told him so. And he blew my mind. He was so authentic. And I called Norman and said, I'm coming over right away. You got to meet. And the actor was Scott Wilson, who I feel is one of the underappreciated actors in film.
For those of you who don't know him from that film, he's now enjoying a sort of renaissance as Herschel Green on The Walking Dead.
Oh, and an interesting thing happened. Well, anyway, I won't go into that story. Go ahead.
Okay.
Boy, could I go off the track.
Hopefully we can get you back there. And then after In the Heat of the Night, it was the Thomas Crown Affair, which is not only a wonderful film, but has the very specific distinction of having bestowed upon Lynn the very first single card main title credit, casting by.
And that was not only involved Norman Jewison's generosity, and we had more fun. We had more laughs when we were casting. And in the room was Hal Ashby, an Academy Award winning film editor.
Yeah.
And we were really all very close. And so I want to point out something about the courage of directors. He felt that Steve McQueen could play the sophisticated, wealthy character in the Thomas Crown Affair, which would have been a really innovative step for Steve. And, you know, these things happen to me along the way. I happened to see this the other night. I was watching part of a picture I did with Adrian Lyne called 9.5 Weeks. Now, Adrian believed that Mickey Rourke could play that, whatever he was, a Wall Street, and all the producers and everybody said, I don't know. And, but the courage of some directors, most directors.
So Hal Ashby was in the editing room for a number of the films that you cast. The Russians Are Coming, In the Heat of the Night, the Thomas Crown Affair, and then began his directing career and your very long collaboration.
Well, I knew Hal's talent, and I was so pleased that that Norman decided to give a project he was going to direct to Hal Ashby for his debut. And that picture, and I hope you've all seen it, was The Landlord. And it starred Beau Bridges, and really, because it was filming in New York, we cast 95% of the film in New York. And, you know, Lee Grant, it goes on and on.
It has a fantastic performance from Pearl Bailey.
Pearl Bailey. And it's a remarkable piece of filmmaking that I wish you would all see when you can, if you haven't. But I spent a lot of time casting in New York. Many other pictures that just filmed in New York. And it seemed like I was always on an airplane. My daughter will attest to that. And I not only would fly to New York, but in the early 60s, on the Goldwyn lot, I was introduced to John Sturges. And he was, do you want me to get into this right now?
Sure.
Okay. He was about to direct a film called The Great Escape. Now, we wanted authenticity. In other words, I didn't enjoy watching Brits with British accents playing Germans. You know what I mean? As great as these actors were. And they sent me to my first trip to Europe in the early 60s. And first I went to London, and I was they treated me very well. I was at, I think, Savoy or one of those nice hotels. And in came all of these actors that, including Richard Harris, and to play the lead, and eventually it was Richard Attenborough, because Richard Harris wasn't available. I'd been led to believe he was. And
that never happens anymore.
And then in came all of the actors who were in The Great Escape, and that included Donald Pleasance.
And there was a German actor.
Well, I'm going to get to
Oh,
that. Anyway, that's when I got acquainted with the British scene. And of course, it was very exciting. And then I went on from there to Munich, where we filmed. And in came all of the outstanding German actors. Now remember, this is 1961 or 2, I guess.
I think 2, yeah.
And not many of them spoke English. And I had a wonderful lady with me that I met in Germany named Renata Neuchel, who was multilingual and eventually went around the continent with me, around the European continent with me on so many other films. But some of them spoke a little English, and we read together. And I even went to Switzerland, to Zurich, to meet a German star named Hannes Messimer, who he played the commandant of the prison camp. But you can imagine what an excitement this represented for me. And then I would find the answer in very unexpected places. It's like when I was doing Fiddler on the Roof, I found a Russian boy on an instinct to go to Rome. A Russian boy in Rome? Yes. But
I want to circle back to Hal Ashby for a moment, because following The Landlord, a film you're now required to see, in 1971 came Harold and Maude.
Now, and I had met, I can't always remember the chronology. I had met an actress in London named Vivian Pickles, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, but we cast her as Bud Cort's mother, and she was fabulous. But again, it didn't have to be an American actress. And I think Cyril Cusack was in the film as well. And
It's full of great supporting roles. Charles Tyner, the general with the one arm that kept flapping up.
And, this is the turn on for what we do, is meeting. You never know who's going to walk in the door. Each day, whether you're in New York or you're here or you're in Duluth, Minnesota, you have to, it requires great concentration, which I admire in casting directors. Because when you're reading, you have to really observe. The reading may not be spectacular, but you have to observe reactions and the little nuances, or that an actor is bringing something that the director really didn't expect. I'm getting off the track.
No, all of that is fantastic.
And
following Harold and Maude and a series of great films with Hal Ashby, The Last Detail with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, because it came down to Randy Quaid and a young John Travolta, who a personal manager in New York had called me and said, there's a young actor coming out there. He wants to continue in the theater. I believe he should have a movie career. And in walked John Travolta. But it was one of those instances where it could have gone either way. And
this is one of those cases where the actors do their best work in the room, and what happens after you leave the room has almost nothing to do with the comparative quality of what you do. As long as I'm saying this to actors all the time, if you prepare, you make choices, you deliver what you intend to do in the room, you've done your job. And then what happens after that door closes is a dialogue with the filmmakers for a million different reasons, mostly, hopefully, having to do with the narrative of the story and how a choice of a particular actor is going to impact the telling of that story.
And blend into the ensemble.
And blend into the choices you've already made or plan to make. So, you know, this was a case, I'm sure, that John Travolta and Randy Quaid both gave fantastic auditions.
I think not, Randy was nominated for an Academy Award,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
And
But
so
you-
John could have
you
been
had- you
nominated.
exactly, but
And he
you
was
had
only
a
about 18
you had a
or
decision
19.
to make, and you made it for the right reasons for the telling
But you
of the
know,
story.
Hal Ashby did something that I think you actors will appreciate. And he alluded to it, I think. And that is that you never know why you didn't get the part. You know, because it's all those intangibles. Or the part was a male and now it's a female. Or I don't know.
The casting is an evolutionary process, and sometimes the thing that you think you're looking for at the beginning of the process isn't what you end up. You know, you discover it's sort of for the filmmakers, it's the crucible in which they sort of figure out what the hell this thing is that we're all making, and casting is a huge, huge part of that process.
And then that's why you can't always go with what's written on the script page. And, you know, The Graduate was the perfect example. They tested, before I was called in, they tested Robert Redford. And that's why later, as I began to see, we weren't succeeding in that particular image. And I brought in Richard Dreyfuss, and, you know, and then eventually Dustin Hoffman. And
Who was the farthest thing from what was on the page, right?
exactly. You know, and the thing is that all of these directors are so open-minded. Anyway, go on.
Well, Mike Nichols certainly was in the casting of Dustin Hoffman in that role. And then
You know,
also with
there's
you first.
all right, there's a story there. I was so excited that we were casting Gene Hackman as one of the fathers in The Graduate. And for some reason, and by the way, Gene Hackman, who I got close to, he lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I lived for years. And he gave me permission to tell this story. Because I said, if I'm ever with actors, I'd love to show them this story, which, you know, it was a very personal thing. Mike said, we have to let Gene Hackman go. He suddenly realized he wanted a different image there. And so I said, Gene, it shows even one of the great actors, later he became one of the great actors of the 20th century, can face rejection and yet overcome and...
Wow, I didn't know that story.
French
That's
Connection.
a good one. Rounding out the Hal Ashby list, Coming Home in 1978.
Coming Home, you can imagine. And by the way, I was able to introduce a New York actress named Penelope Milford. She played the close friend of, I think she may have been nominated,
She was.
of Jane Fonda. And in any event,
It's a great film.
you know, both John and Jane were nominated. They won, didn't they? I think
John definitely won.
Yeah.
Being There in 1979, Peter Sellers, Shirley MacLaine, Melvyn Douglas.
Oh, Peter Sellers. Oof.
He could have played every part in that.
And Shirley MacLaine. Oh, what a performance. Go ahead.
And then someone who I think you met casting a Ben Casey episode came into your life, Sidney Pollack.
Yes. So many directors whom I later collaborated with on movies, somehow it started, and we were bringing all kinds of actors out from New York at that time, George C. Scott and Steve Hill, and so that show, the producer, everything about it, it was quality.
This was Ben Casey?
Ben Casey.
Yeah, yeah. And then Sidney began directing, and I think the first one was The Scalp Hunters, was it, with Burt Lancaster?
Yeah, I think Sidney Pollack I don't know if he had worked at Universal. Anyway, The Scalp Hunters with Burt Lancaster, Telly Savalas,
Ossie Davis.
Ossie Davis.
Yes.
And
then you did Castle Keep with Sidney.
yes.
And hired Scott Wilson again.
Yeah, and Scott then did a number of pictures for me,
And then They Shoot Horses, Don't They?
with, and that...
Which is one of the great ensembles.
Oh.
And there's some choices in there. I mean, Red Buttons.
He was wonderful, yeah.
Where does that come from? Just in a moment of inspiration? I mean, that's really...
Well, and a lot of these ideas came from the director. I don't want to...
Modesty.
No, I mean, I don't want to presume to say, that I was the one who came up with the idea.
It's a
but I
collaboration
would give
with
them
others.
options, and then they made the final choice, the directors.
Again with Sidney Pollack, Jeremiah Johnson, Absence of Malice, and Tootsie.
And there were several directors before Sidney. Hal Ashby, but he was then got very...
Tootsie had a long road to the screen, didn't it? It took a long time to make that movie.
It did, and I remember that when I used to meet with Dustin, because Hal Ashby was busy editing 8 Million Ways to Die, and we would talk about various actors, and I remember I made up a list for the agent, and for some crazy reason I put Sidney Pollack down, but it was the fact that Dustin said to Sidney, "You intimidate, I've got to have somebody that intimidates me," and we know what a powerhouse Sidney Pollack was as an actor as well.
So many great supporting players in that. I think it was the first time we saw Gina Davis in a film.
Oh yeah,
right?
in New York. I worked out of the Screen Directors Guild, and I think Robert Benton and Bob Fosse were casting on the other side of me in the Directors Guild. And in walked this very tall, attractive lady I'd never heard of named Gina Davis. And I said, wouldn't that be delightful of this tall girl next to Dorothy and his going crazy, about her and her casual undies. And Sidney, of course, bought it. And
so many great choices. I mean, Doris Bellick as the show's director, when she says, "I'd like to make it look a little bit more attractive. How far can you pull back?" And the cameraman says, "How do you feel about Cleveland?"
I mean,
that's with one line that guy scores, big time.
Well, there've been, I'd mentioned to you earlier, I always asked actors, I said, do this small part with this director, because an actor can make a real significant contribution, even with a reaction or one line. And where was I? What's
No, that cameraman delivering that line is a perfect example of that. And then Woody Allen called.
Well, Woody Allen, and generally with Marion Doherty and
Juliet Taylor.
Who did, were spectacular casting directors, are incredible casting directors. Did all of his pictures in Manhattan, but he decided to come to California to do Sleeper. And I'll tell you why that was a very peculiar challenge for me. First of all, as Woody said, we worked we cast in a room with a pool table in the center of it, and he would stand off in the corner, and because it was very uncomfortable.
The opposite of what you had been used to with directors who loved actors and were open
actors previously, and what he wanted was kind of foreign to me. He wanted very, what is the word, David? Ordinary looking. He wanted a contrast to his bizarre character. You remember the bread bowl, the flour and all that? And so I brought in, and many of them were New York actors, but I brought in a lot of actors who were
ordinary looking
and
not specific, you mean, not the way you usually did.
But very good, and that's what he wanted for that particular film.
Wow. And then also in the mid-'70s, you worked with Ted Kotcheff on the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, which was another, not discovery, but another situation where you gave somebody an opportunity.
It was one of those rare things where and it doesn't happen that often, where I said to Ted, after I'd read the script, I said, Ted, you're going to want to meet every actor here in New York for Duddy Kravitz, because he couldn't find him up in Canada. They were shooting, I think, in Montreal. And I said, but I'll bring in every actor here in Los Angeles. And I told him about a young actor represented by Meyer Michigan. He must have been 18, 19 years old, and named Richard Dreyfuss. And Richard walked in for the reading, and Ted kind of looked at me, like, and then Richard absolutely scored and played the lead in Duddy Kravitz. Later we did a sequel called Joshua and Then and Now of Duddy growing up, and that was played by James Woods. And Alan Arkin played, as I remember, a gangster character in it. And I would see Alan Arkin when I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he says, you know, and this is before all the consummate work he's done since, he says, I really love that role. I really enjoyed that role. And of course, he played the Russian in The Russians Are Coming, and was hysterical.
I have to ask you about Superman, 1978. Now that was, go for it. That must have been a search.
Well, before they called me in, Richard Donner and the Salkinds, they had considered every well-known actor, including, I think, Redford and I don't know who else. And they tested. They were so desperate that the wife of one of the Salkinds went to the dentist one day, and she looked up and said, "It's Clark Kent." And they tested the dentist. That's how desperate they were. Now, hello. I've had some similar experiences that worked out, but not. And then, on one of my New York trips, I went to see a play with Katharine Hepburn and an actor named Christopher Reeve. And I was really, taken with his acting. And I invited him in, to wherever I was, Sherry Netherlander, to talk with him. And it just, that feeling you get when you're in the presence of something special, which happens so many times with actors and actresses. And so I cast him in a picture called Gray Lady Down at Universal. And it was a very small part, but I wanted to get him into film. And then when they called me and said, we can't find Superman, it was natural for my lights to go off in the brain. I said, oh my God, Christopher Reeve could play both characters. So, and he tells that fun story, which I think was even in that little clip you saw. I don't know if he was still in New York then, I kept putting his picture on the top, and at the end of the day, they would put it on the bottom. But I wouldn't give up. And finally, they met with him, and I don't think, and we're talking about that particular year. I'm not making this a generality about all time. At that moment in time, here, New York, anywhere, he was the ideal choice. And they tested him in London, and Margot Kidder, who I had used in Gaily Gaily, I think, with Norman, Canadian actress. And, this is what's so gratifying, and replaced any gratification I would get acting in the theater. All of this, to reach out a helping hand to actors. And to serve the director, because that the marketplace is enormous. when you think about it. I was also constantly not only aware of what was happening in New York, even in the early 60s, but in repertory theaters, you know, the Louisville, the Arena. In fact, I heard about Ned Beatty, who was at the Arena, and I saw Ronnie Cox on Broadway. I think, was he in The Great White Hope? Ed Sheeran was a great asset to me in terms of introducing me to New York people. And I'm getting off the track. Where was I?
No, I think pulling people in from their theater backgrounds. I mean, I'm just thinking about the.
Oh no, but Ned Beatty said,
Oh.
"I can't do it. I've got a contract here at the Arena." And I said, "Ned, you've got to do it." And then we started to test people, and that's another story. And we worked it out for him to make the rehearsals and fly back and appear with Ronnie Cox in those two roles.
Speaking of Ronnie Cox, I'm just thinking about your work on location and location casting, because your work on Deliverance was incredible. I mean, across the board, and I know that you did a lot of location casting on that film, not to mention that incredible boy with a banjo.
Do you know the reason producers and studios insisted, particularly in those days, maybe not as much today, I can't speak for that we cast as much as we could on location? Now, what was the reason for that? Yes, it was budget. And yes, it was, you know, to fly an actor in from LA or New York for one day, and then the schedule changes and goes, you know what I'm saying? And so I began, and there were very few agents and all these, you know, I bet I went to 70% of the states of the United States to cast on location. And I found some remarkable natural talents there. Like if it was a farmer in the river who had to say, I'm not going to be able to survive. Why not use a farmer? I mean, it was mandatory from the studio standpoint.
But you got, as a result, incredible authenticity that, you know, is hard to beat.
And then I met a lot of actors on these locations who didn't have the courage to go into New York. You know, they figured there's so much competition. And so there were experienced actors, and I can't tell you all those stories, but, and incidentally, a great source for casting children was on location. And you had to luck out, you know, that, and I would sometimes see hundreds of children on location. It's like in Kingsport, Tennessee, where we shot The River. I had open calls, and a young boy came in, 12 years old, who was the image of Mel Gibson. And I worked with him, and I felt he could do it. And then a young girl came in, and she could be Sissy Spacek's daughter. I mean, it was just startling. And of course, Mark bought this.
Mark Rydell.
Mark Rydell. And the same thing, you know, even happened on Winter People in Asheville, North Carolina. I had a big open call on a picture called Winter People with Kurt Russell and Kelly McGillis and Lloyd Bridges. And out of that came the little girl. But the director, Ted Kotcheff, looked at me and said, are you going to be there when it's 5 degrees above zero? And I'm working with a actors. So it posed a challenge to them. Move on.
Okay. I don't want to ignore your distinguished work in television, because you, particularly for me, cast some of the seminal television shows of my youth. In addition to Ben Casey, Hogan's Heroes. Yeah. You met Werner Klemperer in Munich, I think, on that initial trip for The Great Escape.
I'm trying to remember.
Because I know you cast Werner Klemperer very early.
Yeah, he was in Judgment at Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And there were a few, fine German actors in L.A. at the time we cast.
Leon Askin and those people.
No, yeah.
Yeah. My Favorite Martian. And of course, we saw Welcome Back, Kotter. I remember a TV movie that you cast called The Girl Most Likely To, which started the career of Stockard Channing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was just, as there are today, there was just a wealth of talent here, New York, everywhere.
And then at the heyday of the miniseries, the television miniseries, a little show called Roots. Now I really feel like James Lipton. A little show called Roots.
You know, there's a fascinating story there, which I wasn't planning to tell. But when we were doing Roots, in the 70s, I authorized my office to send out to all of the universities across the country that had drama schools, theater schools, like Northwestern, you name it. And we sent that out to UCLA and the USC. And a young man came in to read for Kunta Kinte, and his first reading was very stilted. He had a career entirely made up of the peddler in Oklahoma at USC. He had and he was very sweet and his first reading was, it wasn't truthful. And this actor was LeVar Burton. And so I talked to him for a while and I said, relax and just play it as though you are the character. And he made the adjustment. Now again, David Wolper and David Green, who directed much of the Roots, had to have the courage with all of those brilliant African American actors and Caucasian actors in Roots to go with a total unknown who'd never been in front of a camera. But it's part of the excitement of what we do. And all of the casting directors have similar stories. But this is not all exclusively Lynn. It's just, and it's been going on for a long time, and that's why I have such admiration for so many casting directors.
Well, there are actors similarly who you helped along very early on in their careers. You mentioned James Caan. John Voight is another actor that very early on you championed.
When John came out from New York in the early mid-'60s, his agent Sal Krugman, a very perceptive agent, he said, I want you to meet a young actor who just came out from New York, John Voight. And we met, and I was doing a picture called Hour of the Gun with John Sturges, Jason Robards, James Garner. And there was a role in there, and I read John, and by the way, we were on a panel recently, and I check out these stories to make sure this isn't some fantasy, some dream I had. And John remembered that he said to me, but there's nothing here, there's no character. And I said, John, I want you to work with John Sturges, the director of The Great Escape and, so many major Westerns and what have you. And I want the Mirage Corporation to know you and United Artists. And he finally agreed to do it. But this is a premise, and I know that all the casting directors follow these same precepts, that you want to get the actor on film and then watch his growth. And then, all kinds of, I did a film called Flesh and Blood, a television film. And I don't know if it was in Chicago or New York, and it was with Tom Berenger, John Cassavetes, Eli Wallach, Susan Plachette, who was an outstanding dramatic actress. And either in New York or Chicago, in walked an African-American actor named Denzel Washington. And
this was in the late 70s.
Yeah, and we never met again, but he played like a trainer of Tom Berenger, who was a boxer. Anyway.
You also, in an innovative way, have used athletes as actors in films.
Well, in a couple of films that I did, it not only required an African-American basketball player, but someone with a sensitivity. It's like I did a film with Mike Newell called Amazing Grace and Chuck, which again, was not exact. Gregory Peck, Jamie Lee Curtis, CSI.
William Peterson.
Thank
yeah.
you. And, a lot of actors wanted to do it because it spoke a message against nuclear energy. And it required a young boy. And again, I went to the Minneapolis Children's Theater, and I interviewed, non-actors everywhere, including LA, and I found a young boy in Minneapolis. And then in the film, the lead was a basketball player, a major star in the NBA. Well, there aren't many actors that could look like and be 6'5" or 6 and play basketball, which he had to do on screen. And I went all over the country. I even went, in Philadelphia, there are a lot of street players, that never got to college and never made it, but they were as good as some of the pros. And I was in a gym auditioning actors and shooting baskets. This little shrimp. And, but I was a basketball player, believe it or not. And then I went to Denver to meet Alex, who, by the way, Alex English was not one of the greatest pure shooters in the history of the game, and a Hall of Famer. And I read him, and he eventually played the role. And I found that so many athletes have the innate, it's like athletics. An actor can't decide on a reaction or the way he's going to read a line until he plays, and an athlete has to make adjustments all the time. What will the player on the other side? Anyway.
Being in the moment is essential for
and
for the
I also
athletics.
at one point cast, I don't know if you've heard of Bernard King, but another Hall of Famer and one of the great shooters. In fact, he and I became friends, and I went to see him play. And Bill Russell. Now, you all know who Bill Russell is. I had him read for a picture I was doing in Chicago, and he played the lead and was marvelous. And what a beautiful soul he is. And opposite the young man who was very short. Anyway.
Hit it.
You may leave the room. I was depending on you. Anyway,
We'll get back to you on that one.
I think Maureen Stapleton was in that movie too. But anyway, I found that athletes, when I did North Dallas 40, some of the actors in the piece were former
athletes.
or.
I want to talk more conceptually and practically about the casting process from your perspective, because I'm sure that it's changed to some degree over the years, and in many ways hasn't changed at all. What ways did you find to help an actor? I'll take care of this.
Would you do that?
What ways did you find to help an actor in an audition process? I mean, you talked about giving them as much information as possible.
Well, what I would do with actors, and David and I happened to talk about this the other day, I wanted to make sure because I'd been through this process and suffered, and I was a terrible first meeting individual. I really choked up, and particularly if it was a cigar-smoking producer, I couldn't handle all that. So I wanted to make the actor and actress comfortable, and the two chairs opposite me in my office, I wanted them to be firm. I didn't want the actor to sink into and lose the energy required in certain scenes. And since I couldn't give them the whole script, it wasn't permitted, and only the sides, I would try, and directors did this as well, to give them, before they came in to read for the director, as much information and who these other characters were in the scene. Who are you relating to? Is it your brother? Is it, because all of that was a mystery. I hated to keep actors waiting, but it's an inevitable event. The director's late, or he gets involved with one actor, and meanwhile there's 4 outs. And I tried as often as possible, and this wasn't always possible, if 2 actors were up for the same role, not to have them sit together in the waiting room.
I remember when we were together, it was always about staggering the roles on an interview sheet so that you ideally, and of course you can never anticipate every situation, but ideally not have actors run into other actors who are auditioning for those same roles.
There's such anxiety when you come in, particularly if you're about to meet a Sidney Pollack. And that was another thing, by the way, that I know this is part of the acumen, the attitude of casting directors today and all through the last 60 years is I lost the thought.
Well, I'm going to point out one way that I think you've helped actors tremendously, and that has to do with your own preparation as an acting casting director in reading opposite the actors. Because that impressed me tremendously when we worked together, and I've tried to do it myself since.
By the way, he's an excellent actor when he reads. And most casting directors are, even though all of us didn't come from the acting ranks. Some of the most brilliant casting directors.
Well, I think being there for an actor and knowing your lines as well as and being as much off book to have contact with an actor is obviously a tremendous help. And we've all heard nightmare stories from actors about casting directors who were standing there with the script up. And
I was reading with people who weren't even looking at me when I was an actor.
And I think that's an enormous help.
Yes, and the reason for that, which is an obvious one, is there are so many. I think I may have said this earlier. If you're not, I like to look into the eyes of the actor and see what's going on, even if the reading is not exactly right. And there's so many little nuances that we all pick up that lead us to believe this is someone who could definitely play this and who I want to expose to the director.
Some of those nuances actually happen when the scene goes awry. When somebody, actors beat themselves up all the time because it's never as good as it was in the bathroom mirror that morning. But sometimes, when there's that moment when you're still in the character, but something messes up, so then you're really exposing who you are in the character. That is an enormously enlightening moment for a casting director, I think, to see a connection between that actor and that role. So it doesn't always need to go so perfectly. Before the days of the internet and databases, how did you keep track of actors and?
Well, as the years went by, I established contacts, not only in the obvious places, New York, Chicago, London, Toronto, Montreal, and I gradually, going to these other locations, would find somebody that I could contact when I was casting. Because, each film, and that was part of the excitement we experienced, is that each one is a brand new challenge, a brand new cast of characters. So it's never boring. It's...
And did you keep note cards?
I was a very avid note taker. I had my own language that I would, use, not right for this part, but maybe for that picture I'm about to do. And I would go through my notes constantly, and if I didn't remember, and rely a great deal on them.
And also, this was the time, largely, before videotaping actors.
Right. That, of course, was a marvelous
development in the process. Yeah, but, there is thanks to videotape, there's an opportunity to revive an actor in the casting process that you didn't have then. So did you also encourage the filmmakers to make notes as well? And because I find directors and producers now rely on the videotape and they don't jot down what their thoughts are. And sometimes what you're thinking in that moment right then is the gut reaction that you should have to an actor's performance. And that gets lost.
David, I was a paper saver, you know, and I would literally drown in my office at home in papers. And by the way, recently I found a lot of notes, some from Sidney Pollack, because like when I'd go to Santo Domingo, there was hardly...
This was on Havana, right? On Havana?
This is on Havana. Yeah. Or I went to Puerto Rico, always looking, and we were very truthful, Sidney and I, to only using Hispanic actors. They weren't all from Cuba. In fact, we wanted to shoot in Cuba, but at that time you couldn't, you know. And I found Sidney's notes when he would look at the videotape with me in Santo Domingo, and he wrote little notes and said, could be soldier number 3, you know? And so, and then he had the videotapes.
But before videotapes, it really involved careful note-taking and
Yes.
Clearly a good memory. There are some phrases that you don't like in the casting process.
I hate the word type. Get me Gregory Peck type. There is no such word and in all of our vocabularies. And, get anybody to play that. No.
The small part that anybody can play.
Yeah, it's like on Tootsie, you know, the fans in front of the studio, the Studio New York, they had 1 or 2 lines. I lost one of them. And I told Sidney to go to tape number 4, number 364, because we just, you know, we took so much care, and directors, you know, detail is what makes pictures elevate. They elevates films.
And when you're first meeting an actor, what's the question you would never want to ask them?
I said, what have you done? How tall are you? You know, all of those stock questions. I'd want to, and everybody, you know, this is commonplace. You want to put the actor at ease and maybe talk about some extraneous subject like, you know, what are your hobbies? You know, or just to try to humanize the process rather than be doing the stilted old hat way.
I'm curious what you think about the acting pool today and the work of casting directors today by comparison?
I cannot tell you how impressed I am with the quality of casting and the quality of acting today. It is so superior.
Really?
And I don't want to sound pompous, but I just admire all the casting I'm observing, you know, on HBO and on the networks and in the theatrical films. So you can tell I'm very emotional about it. I really feel that over the last 60 years, casting has never diminished in quality.
What are the qualities of a good casting director?
I think we have to be able to concentrate, because you don't want to miss something, you know. I've already alluded to this, and just an innate sense of you're meeting a very special talent, whether it be for 1 or 2 lines or a lead or whatever. And all of the current crop, you're all doing incredible work. It's just, I can't laud you enough.
Well, I keep thinking of another word that you use frequently to talk about the casting process, which is open.
Open is my favorite word. Probably a lot of people are bored hearing me say it. But you just have to be open And when you're doing auditions and readings,
You never know.
you can't let your energy. If I got tired, let's say in New York, and I would usually work out of hotels, I would have to psych myself up in the afternoon because you don't want to miss something at 6 o'clock at night, just because your mind is tired. And my most productive times, have I said this? I would get up around 5 in the morning in my home office, and at that point I could call London, I could call Paris, I could even, around 7:30 reach New York, and that was the most creative time for me before the phone started to ring and before the craziness, of the day set in. And what was the question?
I don't care. That was a good answer. I think, are there any questions from the audience we could take now? Thanks very much. Okay, we'll take just... Sorry? Fast break. Thank you. You can stay. Okay, I'm just going to leaf through here. Well, I'm going to bring up an actor who is now enjoying a real moment in the spotlight, and I'm curious about your experience with Bruce Dern.
Well, I'm so thrilled that he's finally being so recognized in that brilliant performance. I saw it the other night in Nebraska. Of course, that meant a lot. He was playing a Cornhusker, like me. And Bruce came to my attention very early. And you could just, again, sense that he was a very thoughtful, prepared actor. I don't know where Bruce studied originally.
Yeah, I don't know.
Whether he came from New York? Maybe somebody here knows that. But
Chicago, Philadelphia, then New York.
what's that?
Wow.
Actors Studio. And of course, I was always interested in people who had been at the Actors Studio, and or with Stella Adler or Lee Strasberg or Herbert Berghoff. I mean, there were so many great teachers. And by the way, the resume was very important. And actors do not misrepresent their past histories. I found this as a rule. There's such integrity in that resume. And I love the fact that they've been in repertory. Where am I?
No, I think that's it. But you're gratified by Bruce's recognition.
Oh,
in
I'm
this
so
performance.
happy. And for example, on my first trip to New Mexico, I did a picture called The Cowboys with John Wayne and Roscoe Lee Brown, and Bruce played a very obvious villain. He was an antagonist to John Wayne, and had to have the power to stand up. He was wonderful. And then we saw what he did in Coming Home. Yeah. Bruce is just a consummate actor, and finally, it looks as though he's going to get some total appreciation.
Here's a question that I had thought of to ask as well. Did you know that both two films that you worked on, Mandingo and Mommy Dearest, would become enduring classics of camp? And can you speak to their legacy?
I don't usually talk about those two pictures.
I'm so glad somebody brought them up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really can't we move on? But Mommy Dearest was directed by Frank Perry at the end of his career. He had done some classic films and what was the other one?
Mandingo. Well, listen, those casts cannot be faulted. I mean, those are fantastic ensembles.
Well, James Mason, I think, played the lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked with Richard Fleischer many times. The New Centurions, George C. Scott, Stacy Keach, and anyway.
We'll let you off the hook. When actors audition, they may feel nervous or may project neediness or desperation. Any advice for actors wanting to appear calm and self-possessed?
Well, I think actors have to realize that we're pulling for them, for you, not them, to make a real impact. So if I sense that an actor or actress was having a bad day, had a terrible cold, and there are all kinds of reasons that we all can have bad days, breaking up with a woman, this is just countless. I wanted to call the actor back again to give an opportunity. I had a funny experience in New York. I was doing a picture with Martin Ritt called Conrack, John Voight, Hume Cronin. And I brought in an actress named Madge Sinclair in New York. And Madge was a very attractive woman. And she came in, looking very sophisticated and gave a great reading. And Martin returned to me and said, "She's not right for this." I later called Madge and I said, "I want you to come in character tomorrow." He didn't recognize her. She gave a spectacular reading and she plays a principal role. So you have to realize that, and you can't be judgmental. I remember Ellen Burstyn in the early days. She had a different name then. It may have been Ellen Marshall. It was just an attractive young lady. She wasn't. And then actors grow. You have to remember that. And what you see in 1962 can be a totally different individual and talent in 1968.
What are the best ways to change a director's mind?
Oh, I think it really is to say, "Would you mind if I tried something?" No, go ahead. And you bring in an actor that, again, is not what the original concept was. But directors are generally so perceptive.
One thing that I learned from you, which I've also passed on to associates that have worked with me, is that Lynn always, in a casting session, when it came time for everybody to sort of recap the session, he would always take the temperature of the room. He would always first listen to what the director had to say and what the producer had to say, because he had his own agenda, which was to try to lead them in a certain direction toward a certain actor, a particular reading, a particular choice. And it wasn't until you learned where everybody was on that subject that then enabled you to navigate an argument addressing each of their points in the favor of your point of view.
You all do that.
And that, well, I learned it from you, and that to me is one of the ways to change a director's mind. By understanding their position, acknowledging it, and then finding a way to represent your own.
And in fairness, the director, I'll give you an example, absence of malice. Sidney and I had cast, Wilfred Brimley way back in television days, Amber Waves, the picture I did with Joe Sargent, another wonderful director. And he said, I think Wilfred Brimley is the answer. Do you remember that great scene at the end? It's a classic scene. And I said, well, Sidney, can I show you a few other ideas? I think you're right, And he said, yeah, go ahead. And he was absolutely right. Wilfred Brimley was brilliant. And so sometimes they're married to a thought, their original thought, and that's what happens.
But sometimes you can look at a script and ignore the description of the character and bring in somebody.
And experiment, and that's why directors are so comfortable to work with. They're not married to it has to be this way.
Well, when they're listening to you, they're comfortable to work with. thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. Oh.